This next lecture is in memory of Nikolay Bukharin, Bolshevik and Marxian and economist, who was a prominent leader of the Communist International. This lecture is titled Karl Marx and the Opium Wars and will be delivered by Eugenio Sardo, General Director, National Archives, Rome. This lecture will be chaired by Roberto Masari, President, International Che Guevara Foundation, Italy. Can I request our speaker and our chair to please come on stage? Roberto Masari graduated at Rome University in philosophy, at Trento University in sociology, and at Ismeo of Rome on India's culture and language, at the Conservatorium of Perugia in piano. He published his first sociological research in 1966. Since then, he has written more than 30 books. He is the president of the International Che Guevara Foundation. In 2018, he hopes to finish the 2 books that he considers the most important in his life, one on Lenin and another on Jesus. Can I now request the chair to please take over the proceedings?
I have the pleasure to present a speaker from my own town. He lives in Rome. He was not born in Rome, but he lives in Rome. And besides that, we have a very important common friend, Enzo Modugno, he's living, but he was the director of the Italian edition of Monthly Review. And then he founded, together with him, the review Marxiana, which is, it was an important review in the alternative left of Italy, dedicated completely to the study of Marx. So he has been the founder of this magazine. He has written books of history, especially regarding Asia, and today he's going to speak exactly on the Opium Wars in the view of Marx. And he is the director of the Archivio di Stato, which are the state archives in Rome. And this is a strategical place, because nobody in Italy can write a book of history without going through these archives, which are very big, very rich. Also because we have been under a fascist rule for 20 years, and so all the reports of the police about communists, socialists, anarchists, any type, are inside these archives, including about Gramsci, etc., etc. So I have the pleasure to introduce Eugenio Sardo on the theme of the Opium Wars in Marx's view. Thank you very much.
Yeah, this is all right. The first one. Okay. Thank you to everybody. I'm very pleased to be here and to speak about the Opium War, also because my interests have been for a long time focused on China. Not modern China, but more the China discovered by the Jesuits. So I know quite well the reality of that place and the Portuguese expansion in the East, in the 16th century. But the English expansion is not very far from the first proof of the European expansion in the East. And so there are many similarities. Anyway, going to Marx, that I studied when I was very, very young, when I was at my university with Enzo Modugno, that was quoted before, and I often confused. Marx was a very clever student also, and he knew quite well the history and the culture of Hindustan. I don't know if he read the famous travels book written by Ludovico de Vartna in the 16th century, an Italian who came to India before the Portuguese arrival. But Marx certainly knew, like many other German students of this time, the books like Upanishad, already quoted by the famous philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer in 1818 already, in the preface of the first edition of Die Welt als Wille und Vorstellung. He knew not only the story and the culture of the country, but also its economic situation, because his studies were focused on development of the British imperial system in Europe and Asia. The map you see on the screen is a map of the same age, in 1840, is a French map describing the British Empire in India. According to Marx, Hindustan was a country which the Briton dissolved into as many independent and conflicting states as it numbered towns or even villages. A world, he adds, dominated by the religion of the Lingam and the Juggernaut, or Juggernaut, the religion of the monk and of the Bayadere. So Marx knew not only the economic situation of England and Europe, but also the culture and the costume, the uses of Hindustan. The misery inflicted by the British on Hindustan, he adds, was for him very different and intensive, because England had broken down the entire framework of Indian society. The British in the East had neglected the public works, provoking the deterioration of an agriculture which is not capable of being conducted on the British principle of free competition, of laissez-faire and laissez-aller. From immemorial times, Marx states, Europe received the admirable textures of Indian labor, sending in return precious metals and furnishing thereby material to the goldsmith, that important member of Indian society, whose skills were so great that even the lowest class, people going about nearly naked, have commonly a pair of golden earrings and a gold ornament of some kind hung round their necks. It's also interesting the similarity that Marx found between Italy and Hindustan, because he describes the country like an Italy of Asiatic dimensions, the same rich variety in the products of the soil, and the same dismemberment in the political configuration. But he goes on, actually, in his article, in the comparison between Italy and India. And I agree with him, because in many books of the Italian Enlightenment people, at the end of the 18th century, they speak about the colonial situation that Italy was close to experiment because of the aggressive economic development of French and English trade. It's very good example, the case of the Neapolitan kingdom, the kingdom of two Sicilies, which was at a certain point in Sicily overall occupied by the English. Going on with Marx, a few lines later, he clarifies his ideas, and he speaks about small stereotype form of social organism existing in India, which have been to the greater part dissolved and are disappearing, not so much through the brutal interference of the British tax gatherer and the British soldiers, as to the working of English steam and English free trade. Because, he adds, those family communities were based on domestic industry, in that peculiar combination of hand-weaving, hand-spinnings, and hand-tilling agriculture, which gave them self-supporting power. In conclusion, for Marx, the cause of economic decline of Hindustan was the international division of work. The English had placed the spinner in Lancashire and the weaver in Bengal. I don't know why it's not going on. There is something not working. It's now working. Okay. But we saw the English had placed the spinner in Lancashire and the weaver in Bengal. This is a very important concept. Sweeping away both Hindu spinner and weaver, they had dissolved these small semi-barbarian, as Marx states, semi-civilized communities by blowing up their economical basis and thus produced the greatest, and to speak the truth, the only social revolution ever had in Asia. But on the other side, Marx says, we must not forget that these little communities were contaminated by distinctions of caste and by slavery, that they subjugated man to external circumstances instead of elevating man to the sovereign of circumstances, that they transformed the self-developing social state into never-changing natural destiny. So, according to Marx, the British were not in Hindustan to improve the wealth of people, like a famous historian, Trevelyan, states in 1822, but they were answering to a general law, the general law of profit. Also, the Opium War was answering to the same general law, to make profit. Amitav Ghosh, a famous writer, in a recent interview to an Italian newspaper, shared Marx's opinion. Free trade was allowed, he says, only to the Westerners. China and India had commercial links since a very long time. The first had the 24% of the world trade, and the second, the 2%. British were able to destroy the local industry. It was an imperialism of pure exploitation, which introduced drugs, nothing to do with progress. The proof, after independence, India recovered. Fernand Braudel, too, the well-known French historian, which I had the pleasure to meet in French when he was teaching at the Collège de France, thinks the decline of India had an external, not an internal explanation. In a word, Britain. India was for the British an instrument thanks to which they gained access to an even larger area, coming to dominate the Asiatic super-world economy. India, he added, was deindustrialized, reduced to a role of a major producer of raw material, as was Italy in the same time. Few years later, in the winter between 1857 and 1858, Marx was writing the Grundrisse, the foundation of the critique of political economy, published only, as many of you know, in 1953. The Grundrisse are for us very important from a theoretical point of view and extremely interesting for the links suggested between opium trade and the production of contemporary goods. In the second chapter of his copybook, dedicated to the general relation of production to the distribution, exchange, and consumption, Marx writes, production creates, produces consumption, and few lines after he adds, production creates the consumer, not only supplies the material for the need, but it also supplies a need for the material. Therefore, production is consumption. A consumption is production. For example, an object of art creates the public, which is sensitive to art and enjoys beauty. Finally, production produces consumption by creating the material for it, by determining the manner of consumption, by creating the products initially posited as an object of consumption, the manner of consumption, and the motive of consumption. Opium, too, a dangerous drug, was a perfect product creating its consumers and consequentially creating great mass of addicted people. For the Sikhs in Hindustan, the telegraph cables were the ropes swung subjected people, but it was anyway a useful tool. Opium was useless and created diseases, slavery, and death. When in 1856 began the Second Opium War, Marx's workshop was ready to furnish all the necessary tools for a sharp analysis of the war. He wrote several articles in American newspapers that I quoted before to show the economic roots of the conflict and its moral issues. The English, for him, were in war without any moral justification. In England, people like William Gladstone, the famous politician, and James Legge, famous for me because he's translator of Confucius, were against the decision of the government. But why was that war necessary? According to Marx, the reason was simple, as he explains in The Capital. England sends silver to India and buy opium, all of which goes to China to lay down funds to purchase the silk. Not only silk, but also tea. China was not interested in English merchandises. It was a closed market to them. The Chinese had always produced all they wanted. They were in credit, a huge credit, toward England and United States of America. In the first line of Marx's article on this newspaper, published on the beginning of September 1858, he posed another question. It is quite certain that an increase of the Chinese trade must follow upon the multiplication of its emporium? No, he answered. It was not true. Instead of increasing American and English export to China, the war precipitated the commercial crisis of 1847 by raising dreams of a market without exhaustion and by fostering false speculations. The Chinese, therefore, cannot take, according to Marx, both goods and drug. Under actual circumstances, extension of the Chinese trade dissolves into extensions of opium trade. In the same month of September 1858, Marx published another article. We cannot leave, he writes this time, this part of the subject without singling out one flagrant self-contradiction of the British government. In its imperial capacity, it affects to be a true stranger to the contraband of opium trade, and even to enter into treaties proscribing it. Yet, he says, in its Indian capacity, it forces the opium cultivation upon Bengal to the great damage of the productive resources of that country. The British government compels also one part of the Indian ryots to engage in the poppy culture, entices another part into the same by dint of money advances. The government, the British government, runs everything. It keeps the wholesale manufactures of the deleterious drug, and it has a close monopoly in about it. Watches by a whole army of official spies its growth, of the opium growth, its delivery at appointed places, its inspection and preparation for the taste of the Chinese consumers, its formation in packages, especially adapted to the conveniences of smuggling, and finally, its convenience to Calcutta. There it is put up, there in Calcutta, the opium is put up at auction at government sales. Every chest of opium costed about 250 rupees to the producer, and was sold at the Calcutta auction at a price ranging from 1,200 and 1,600 rupees. Not yet satisfied with this complicity, the British government entered into express profit and loss accounts with the merchants and shippers who embarked in the hazardous operation of poisoning an empire. So Marx offers a perfect description of the opium trade, which tied Indians and Chinese in a mortal knot. The Indian finances of the British government were then depending not only on the opium trade with China, but on the smuggling of that trade and on the smuggling of opium. If the Chinese government had legalized the opium trade, tolerating the cultivation of the poppy in China, the Anglo-Indian exchequer would have experienced a serious catastrophe. The British government, openly preaching free trade, secretly defends the monopoly of its manufacture. Whenever we look closely into the nature of British free trade, it's pretty generally found to lie at the bottom of its freedom. Conclusion. In the articles we quoted, Marx offers a very clear picture of the economic roots of the Opium War, studying it like a case in the expansion of the European capitalism. The British had used the sea power to conquer the world. They were establishing, as the Portuguese before, outposts at the mouth of the most important rivers in order to intercept the trade of a specific country, of a continent in this case. And in the specific case of Hindustan, the Ganga River, and China, the mouth of Ganga, and China, the mouth of Xinjiang, of North River Sea. And the same did the Greek in the time of Alexander the Great, founding Alexandria in Egypt. But the merchandise we are speaking of was a very peculiar one, since opium, addicting consumers, created by itself its own market. The drug transformed the subject of an ancient empire into a subject of a drug seller, opening a wide gap between government and people. The Grundrisse explains to us a typical behavior of modern capitalism. It acts in order to create the consumers, to create the necessity of consumption. These actions are not in the field of necessity, they are in the field of drive that will be coercion. The AngloChinese War is an interesting example. The Indian economic system was slowly destroyed, and also the internal political and economic balance of China was destroyed. Two big economies were reduced to peripheral suppliers of raw materials, and their people to endemic modernity. The Chinese opium dreamers and consumers waked up abruptly many years later. Finally, China and the Chinese understood that the problem of their country derivated were due to the Manchu domination, but also by the economic position in the international economic system. The Indian people and the Chinese people, after a long fight, were able to become independent. And now India and China are again a gigantic economy in the theater of the world. But people everywhere must obey, still now, to the financial system diktat and the mermaid of profit. Now, more than before, Marx can help us to answer to the challenges of modern time. Thank you, everybody.
Well, Sardo has used one half of his time, so there is time for plenty of questions and discussions. I only want to remind that in Italy we have a good tradition of discussion about the text of Marx on Asia. Some scholars of Italy have written books about the Asiatic mode of production, like Melotti, Sofri, and others. And I think we are very well connected with the discussion which started in France with the works by Maurice Godelier, etc., etc. So I think that his report must be included in this tradition, which between Italy and France has dedicated a lot of attention to the Asiatic questions. We call it the Asiatic mode of production, but I don't know if that corresponds to other languages. Il modo asiatico di produzione. Yes. Menotti, Sofri, Fratello. So if there is, here is plenty of Asian people. So, okay. Prati, second. Okay. 1, 2, and 3. Okay.
My question is precisely on the Asiatic mode of production, given that there has been a huge critique of Marx's conceptualization of the Asiatic mode of production, and especially Indian Marxists like Irfan Habib, etc., have written very scathing critiques saying that Marx was simply wrong. So the first part of your lecture, in which you essentially say that Marx was very well informed about Hindustan, quote unquote, it kind of is severely in contradiction to the tradition of the debate on Asiatic mode of production in India. So this idea that India was just a conglomeration of villages and a static kind of life, that conceptualization itself has been highly contested. So how does that figure in your understanding of Marx's understanding of India?
Ratish, no, we answer all together. Yeah.
Well, my question is about the addiction. Since we spoke about the opium wars, and we always, I have always read about how the Chinese were affected by it. I wonder if Marx has written about the Indian side of the story, the production, and how it affected the Indian plantations and planters.
Okay. South Korea, yeah? I don't remember the name, but our friend from South Korea.
Yes, this is Song Jin-jung, and that's very interesting talk. And yes, it's especially interesting that you.
We cannot hear from you.
Oh, it is especially interesting that you relate the part in the introduction to the critique of political economy of Marx, written in 1857 and 58. This part about the relation between production and consumption. That part you relate with the Opium War. So I think it's very, let me say, it's very creative. It's an interpretation, because usually that part, introduction to the critique of political economy, the part about the relation between production and consumption. Marx said that production is consumption and consumption is production. That's because for Marx, especially consumption, two kinds of consumption. Consumption of is a usual, is a individual consumer goods, and the consumption of means of production. So when consumption equals, consumption is production, consumption when the consumption is consumption of means of production, that is consuming means of production during the production process, that is also production. So what we usually understand is that the part is written in the abstract level of the method of political economy. But you relate that part to the production and consumption of opium. So I want to know whether, because yes, that part is written during the opium trade.
Thank
so
you.
I would like to know whether you have any factual evidence to interpret the part like that. And one of the small thing is, the Grundrisse, that is in critique of is the foundation of critical political economy. Is first you said that it is published in 1953, but it's the first publication year is earlier than that, 1939 in Moscow. Thank you.
Okay. I've been asked to accelerate, just one moment. I've been asked by the leadership to accelerate the discussion because we are late on the program. So the next question, please do it them in 2 minutes or 2.5 minutes. And let's say 2 more questions. It doesn't work.
I have a very precise observation. You said that Marx had enough knowledge and about the history on India, and so he wrote many things, and you think they were all correct. But now, there were not enough material in front of Marx because they were not found out even by the British. Lot of things, new things have come out in Indian history. And so as Marx, as he found, I said that it was a very fossilized society in India for thousands of years. Now the historical evidence is that that is not a real situation, including the caste system. It was a very dynamic system, not a very static and fossilized as the facts available in the days of Marx was there. So I think that you should rethink over this in light of this new historical evidences by Didi Kosambi, Harish Sharma, Irfan Habib, and many, many more people have written about these things, about the dynamics of Indian society from Indian to the medieval period. That's my only intervention and suggestion on this topic. Thanks.
Thank you. Just one final more question. No. Chiedi a lei quello che non hai capito.
Actually, I am here to learn more than to teach. Certainly, being here in Patna, where was one of the central point of production of opium, is extremely interesting, also from a geographical point of view, not only from a political point of view. Anyway, the first question was about Marx's knowledge of India. I must say that also in my generation, we knew very, very little about India in Europe, very, very little. So I was amazed about the knowledge of Marx of India. Maybe because he was on the harbor, on the Thames River, where many ships arrived. But anyway, the German philosophy was very interested in the Indian religion. As for that, I quoted Schopenhauer in the beginning, that is certainly the more influent philosopher, more influenced by the Indian thoughts. But also Hegel quoted often the Indian religion and uses. Certainly Marx knew India through the experience in London directly, more than in Germany. But for us, East and West, for us, I say, in my generation, we knew very, very little, about nothing, really about nothing. Nowadays, everything's changed. My grandfather arrived in India by ship. There were no airplanes. until maybe the 60s. So it was so far, everything, that we knew only some ideas, without actually no correspondences with the reality of the place. Marx knew well, certainly, the economic system of England and the European economic system. And he understood very well what the free trade problem were. So the Indian case and the Opium War was important from a global point of view. He was certainly not interested in the... For that, it starts with an example comparing India and Italy. It is a strange thing, but it's the story of the Indian silk. Maybe you don't know that, but we have been always in competition because we produce silk. In Sicily, we produce silk, raw material, and we tried always also to make up textile industries in the southern parts of Italy. If you come to Naples, you will see the royal silk industries in San Leucio. It's a beautiful place where is the royal palaces. In Rome, they try to establish the cultivation of cotton and to have the cotton production just to resist to the exportation of the English cotton. So it's similar in many different ways. Like the expansion of Freemasonry, everywhere the English, they had a Freemason society that was part of their commercial system. So this is the first question. The second one is about the Chinese. The Clinton, yes. That is also another important story because the agricultural system of the different countries was modified. I imagine the plantation of Africa now of ananas. There is a beautiful word in geography that I don't know how to translate it in English. In Italian is estrovertire. Extrovertize, an economy is extrovertized. Is trade is no more for the internal economy, but for the external economy. And so you have a plantation, huge plantation. We call the normal peasant is also sometimes the owner of the field. Everybody's become bracciante. Riot is bracciante. Everybody became bracciante, riot. No little owner of the field. And this happened maybe here, according to Marx. There were no more the local system of production, of the agricultural production, but also the textile production, the local textile production. The females in Italy, they had filatoio, the weaver. No. The weavers, they were. In the night, during the winter, they weaved. And like I think also here with the spinning wheel, yes. And then we had a simple kind of the textile industries. And everything was transformed by the international trade, by the capitalism at the end of the 18th century, at the beginning of the 19th century. In China, the process was longer than that, because China had big channels inside, roads, and a very well-connected system in a huge continent. Huge continent. It was under one empire, one emperor, and this emperor remonted to the first millennium before Christ. So it was extremely, India was more divided. The last question, very quickly, I'm sorry, about consumption and production. I think it's very interesting. I like very much modern art. Why do you buy an object of modern art? There is no meaning. There is no meaning. Why we do it? There is not necessity. It's not maybe a desire. It's just because our taste is refined by what we see. And in this case, we are not compelled to buy an object of art, what Marx says in the Grundrisse. In the case of opium, is more the case of a portable telephone, of smartphone, that we are all compelled to buy, and we depend on it directly to something that is far away. We are fragmented, divided, all us, and we are also constrained in some way to buy it. It's a sort of drug in some way. So I think the modernity of the thoughts of Marx in this case is also extraordinary. It's extremely foreseeing, and opium religion is no more the opium of the people. Maybe you have telephones or other things now. Thank you.
The telephone is...
The Grundrisse was published in 1953 in Moscow, if I'm not, yes. But the books by Marx were written between 5 years of time,
almost 1 century before. Almost one century before.
Thank you to everybody.
I'd like to thank our speaker and our chair and request Dr. Sunita Lal to present the memento to our speaker. I'd also like to thank Pratishtha for communicating and translating on behalf of ADRI with some of our delegates.